John Huffman was a city council member, Republican, who later became Southlake's mayor. Back in 2018, he's on tape telling a TV station, racism exists, racism is real, it's all around us, and sweeping it under the rug is not going to help. And he was supporting the city and the school district's efforts to address this. After the diversity plan came out, he said the plan was way too radical. And then he joined this faction of activists in town who created a false story that said this was an attempt by woke Marxists to exploit this moment. He knows the people who were behind the plan. He knows the school board president. He knows that they're not part of some shadow regime. Some of them are progressive and liberals, but some of them were also Republicans like him.
So, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
So let's just start, before we jump into the actual story. How's it going with the book? So, I'm always interested. People put so much time, effort, and research in their life and their soul into producing something like this book that you've produced. And then what happens? How's it going right now?
I appreciate that. I wrote this book with the idea that if you were any parent sitting in a suburb or a community anywhere in the country where you've seen angry parents showing up at school board meetings, kind of complaining about critical race theory or diversity, equity, and inclusion or library books, that they would be able to read this story and understand better why that's happening in their community. That was my biggest hope. And I've been really gratified that I've heard from people all over the country who've said that's exactly what's happened. They read this story of this town in Texas that's representative of a much bigger thing, and they saw themselves. Either they're a teacher who saw their own story reflected, or they're a school board member or a former school board member who saw themselves reflected in the stories, or they're a parent, maybe a parent of a Black child raising their kids in an affluent suburb, and they saw their kid reflected on the pages and felt either less alone or empowered to take a stand in a different way. And so that's been really cool.
We're talking about Southlake, Texas, it's a district that is somewhat or actually affluent, that has world-class public schools. And one of the reasons to move to a community like this is they are able to tout and brag about they have really great schools with a high SAT, a high average SAT score. And it's just the type of place that you would want to move if you were interested in putting your kids in a safe, comfortable and academically advanced district. And this is how people buy their houses all across the country. This is the thing that you look for, right?
Absolutely.
So in this city, though, in this place, in this town, whatever we want to call it, in 2018, there are a group of students, mostly white, and I believe all white female students, are in a video. And in the video, they are chanting the N-word, or they're, using the N-word pretty aggressively. And that video leaks. That gets out into the public, and it causes an emotional response. And it creates pressure on the district to do something. Like, we've got to change somehow. Take it from there, Mike. Like, what happened? So this is 6 years ago. This feels like ancient history in some ways because of where we've come to now with CRT. But that was the flashpoint of something that feels like it's national now. So let's start there. What is that incident, and what does it do?
This is 2 or 3 years before most Americans became familiar with the phrase critical race theory and started seeing parents pack school board meetings. And this is a different time. This is, a couple years into the Trump presidency, as in lots of different ways in America, communities and people and institutions were beginning to reckon with issues around racism and inclusion that have been bubbling at or under the surface for years or decades in the case of Southlake. And so when that viral video of white high school kids chanting the N-word in Southlake kind of went viral, it opened a door for parents, largely parents of Black children in this town, to come forward and say, that video is representative of something bigger. My kid has been coming to school here for years, and the kind of hidden cost of admission to this public school, this great affluent public school, for my Black child is he gets teased. He has to hear white kids saying the N-word, or maybe stupid jokes, racist jokes. There's this kind of range of daily indignities that these kids were experiencing and just kind of accepting as this is normal. This is what life is like in my community. And so as a result of all those parents coming forward in this very conservative town, conservative, mostly Republican leaders of this school district and the city said, this is not who we are. Again, this is 2018 and into 2019. We're going to put together a plan to make Southlake Carroll schools more inclusive and welcoming to everybody. And they put together a volunteer committee that spent 2 years drafting what they called a cultural competence action plan. It's a DEI plan that dealt with diversifying the curriculum, bringing in a more diverse pool of educators so that they don't just have white teachers teaching this increasingly diverse student population. It included diversity and inclusion training for teachers, administrators, and for kids, so that a kid might learn, if you're a white high school student and you're the kind of kid who makes these comments like to a black friend, "Hey, you're the smartest black girl I know." It's a kind of a recurring thing I heard in
Mm-hmm.
Southlake. That
Mm-hmm.
through these lessons or trainings, that kid might realize, oh, that's hurtful. This ties to a much longer history of racism in our country. I'm not going to do that anymore. And so they put together this plan and they released it into the world in the summer of 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, and amidst the growing backlash against Black Lives Matter and the protest for racial justice. And so what happened is some kind of far right conservative parents and activists in Southlake who maybe hadn't been fully paying attention to all of that work for the last 2 years, they saw this plan in the context of the presidential race, in the context of Donald Trump saying the left and the Democrats are planning to destroy the suburbs. And they saw it in the context of a Black Lives Matter takeover of their school district. And they really attacked it in those terms and launched what turned out to be an incredibly aggressive and successful campaign to kill that plan and to replace the school board with far right conservative parents.
So there's a couple of things there that I think are really important, but one part of this I think is so explosive, and we just really need to talk about it quickly. When you just said that this was mostly conservative and Republican leaders who were at the forefront of saying, this is not us, we want to respond to this incident, and we want to go on an exercise to change things, to create a plan for that. So this isn't some super weird lefty kind of, progressive group of people saying, let's create a DEI plan. This is way back in ancient history in 2018, where there was still a faction of conservatives in a town like this who would take the reins and say, we're going to address this. And they came up against this other group of conservatives, and that was the fight. Now, I'm making too much of that this is kind of like conservative on conservative.
Yeah, what was interesting for me to watch as this unfolded was some of the conservatives who supported the diversity initiatives dug in and said, this is the right thing to do. We're doing this because of what we've heard from students and parents. This is to make us a better community because we love this community. And some
Mm-hmm.
of those conservatives who were initially for the plan changed their opinion.
Mm-hmm.
And so, the John Huffman was a city council member, a white city council member, Republican, who later became Southlake's mayor. Back in 2018, he's on tape telling a TV station, racism exists, racism is real, it's all around us, and sweeping it under the rug is not going to help. And he was supporting the city and the school district's efforts to address this. After the diversity plan came out, he said the plan was way too radical, and then he joined this faction of activists in town who created a false story that said this was a attempt by woke Marxists to exploit this moment. And he knows the people who were behind the plan. He knows the school board president. He knows that they're not part of some shadow regime. They're also, a lot of them. Some of them are progressive and liberals, but some of them were also Republicans like him.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But people really adopted this idea that what was this diversity plan was part of this big, shadowy national agenda by woke progressives, as part of this campaign to remake America by indoctrinating suburban school children.
I mean, well, okay, and that's where we are now, where that has taken root. But what's so interesting to me about this last question about them being conservatives in a conservative town who are saying this is not who we are and they're going to address it, is when you look at the plan that they came up with, the Cultural Competence Action Plan, it is so thorough. It is like a masterclass in a response, to a systemic response to an incident like this, that it's so weird that this came out of kind of more traditional conservative people.
Yeah, and I think some of the people who were vocally in support of, just broadly addressing this issue and trying to address the culture, I don't think that they actually knew that it was going to lead to such a robust policy
Hmm.
document that had things
Hmm.
like, more diverse hiring, and which they see
Hmm.
as affirmative action or lowering standards, right? That's the way they present that.
Hmm.
And I don't think that they necessarily recognize they were more in support of what some people might call PR, like posting videos of a diverse group of Southlake residents or kids and saying,
Hmm.
we stand together, and kind of having some meetings and calling that progress. And I think some of those folks were surprised then to see this 36-page document that had like 40 bullet points and, very had the word microaggressions in it and talking about
Hmm.
addressing those types of issues. And so, yeah, you kind of saw this movement of people who supported these initiatives in theory, rejecting it especially once it got branded as part of Black Lives Matter or this kind of leftist ideology.
What I find really interesting as a person who is watching this from a distance, I live in Minnesota. I'm reading this story about Texas. In some ways, in Minnesota, we're better than everybody. Everybody's above average here. So we expect this sort of thing from a southern state and whatever. And that's really unfortunate because Texas is a complex place that deserves a complex understanding, right? We shouldn't just
Yeah.
expect stuff like this from Southlake. But what's so interesting, Mike, about this story to me is the absence of the Black voice. I've read through all of this, and it feels very much like all the actors are white, with the exception of in the beginning when I saw all the parents coming to the school board meeting in 2018 to say our children are hurting, we are hurting. After that, the story seems to not give them the full kind of give them the microphone. So what happens with the Black families? What's their organization like? Their organizing and their response to the story, the change.
Well, several Black families were very involved in putting together the Cultural Competence Action Plan after they had come forward and said, "This is my kid's lived experience." A few of those parents that jump to mind: Angela Jones, who's the mother of three students in town, and then Russell Maryland, former Dallas Cowboy defensive lineman, who was
Hmm.
like a star #1 draft pick. He's been kind of the spokesperson for those families, and after the kind of far right conservatives put together their group, Southlake Families PAC, to fight against the diversity plan, to raise money to win, the school board. Um, Black families in town got organized themselves. They got a group, cultural respect for every dragon. Creed is the acronym,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
they partnered with other progressive groups in town to try to counter this. But um, they're because of the population in Southlake, which has become much more diverse but remains largely white and conservative. Their ability to raise money and to put up a fight was kind of dwarfed by what Southlake Families PAC was doing. They were raising, 10, if they were fortunate, tens of thousands of dollars, whereas Southlake
Hmm.
Families PAC has, $250,000 for a couple school board races.
And where's that money coming from, Mike? Where are they getting that money from?
I will say that it was largely local. Southlake
Hmm.
is one of
Hmm.
these places that there is a powerful local conservative uh, base of power and wealth. Now, Southlake is interesting in that, like, it also the locals include national conservative figures. So, like, Dana Lash is the former NRA
Hmm.
spokesperson, kind of a
Hmm.
far right commentator. She lives in Southlake. She, of course, is donating to the cause. One of the
Hmm.
school board members who gets or school board candidates for Southlake Families PAC is a former clerk for Sam Alito and Clarence Thomas on the Supreme Court, who has, ties to kind of the far right movement to remake the Supreme Court in America. Like, so, that level of expertise and background running for a local school board. And so the Southlake fight is local and national simultaneously. That there wasn't at some point Tucker Carlson was spotlighting what was happening there, and so they received some donations from outside of Southlake, but a lot of the funding was local because they had money to spend.
So you mentioned Tucker Carlson. Is that how this story, this local story, that's this battle becomes nationalized, becomes kind of a national story?
It's part of the story. I became aware of. I'm a reporter for NBC News, and I was watching this story unfold from where at the time I lived in Houston. And so I teamed up with my colleague Antonia Hilton in early 2021, and we kind of did a written article and a piece for NBC Nightly News about this fight, this backlash against diversity and inclusion in this Texas town. It was kind of presented as, at the time, we thought just an interesting story of how backlash against Black Lives Matter was manifesting, and we hadn't fully grasped at that point that this was the leading edge of a much bigger wave of activism that was going to sweep across all of America. Um, and after we did that reporting leading up to the school board election, I think in part because we did that story and a lot of conservatives were upset by the spotlight we put on it, um, people like Dana Lash leveraged their connections to get conservative right-wing media to put their spotlights on it. So in April and May of 2021, following our initial reporting, the Federalist did a series of stories, and then that week, right before their big first, school board election around these issues, Tucker Carlson had Dana Lash on his show to talk
Hmm.
about how she was leading this charge to fight against Black Lives Matter, how Black Lives Matter had taken over her suburban school district, and these conservative parents were fighting back. And at the end of the episode, or at the end of the segment, uh, Tucker Carlson looked into the camera and said, this is happening all over the country. These people are going to come into your schools. They want to hurt your kids. They want to teach them these terrible things. And these parents are fighting back. You can look it up, southlakefamiliespac.org. That's where you can make the
Hmm.
donations. And so that was the beginning of conservative America waking up to this thing in Southlake that was
Hmm.
really a story about bigger political currents that were begun coursing across the country.
And that's what I was interested in a lot around is how this becomes a national playbook for conservatives to say that they can replicate it and put it into other places. And the reason I zeroed in just a little bit on Tucker, because in one telling of the Christopher Rufo story is at some point he's an early 30-year-old, 30-something-year-old, not terribly successful documentarian who gets leaked a training program from Seattle Public Schools from a white teacher who doesn't like a training that they were in. And somehow Christopher Rufo ends up on Tucker Carlson. And somehow the president of the United States, Donald Trump, actually sees that interview and invites this guy, Christopher
Right.
Rufo, to the White House, and he becomes a star pretty quickly. And he is now today who we know him to be. And in this same case, there's this story in Texas. Tucker Carlson puts it out in the world, and then it creates a playbook. So in Williamson County, Tennessee, they say, "Hey, like Southlake is kind of a model here," and national figures get involved, national conservative figures. And you mentioned the Federalist. It feels like I read some connection to the Heritage Foundation being involved in some ways in this, and National Review, right, and others.
Right.
How does this become a playbook, though? Like, how does this become like not a story, but an actual kind of playbook?
That's a great question, because I came into this initially thinking, here's a story about a town that's representative of this bigger thing happening in the country. And then as I was reporting on it, I realized it shifted. It was not just representative. This town was affecting the way this was playing out all over the country because of the things you just talked about. In May of 2021, after Tucker Carlson did that initial segment, that week, Southlake Families PAC won landslide election victories on the Southlake School Board. And in the same way that Tucker Carlson had taken Chris Rufo's idea about critical race theory and kind of turned it into a national conservative talking point, Tucker Carlson and Laura Ingraham and other Fox News personalities and Steve Bannon zeroed in on what happened in Southlake, this local election in Southlake. It led Laura Ingraham's primetime program that some conservative activists had banded together to defeat Black Lives Matter. And what happened afterward was, if critical race theory was the thing we had to attack, Southlake became the way to do it in these schools. And so you started to see, in fact, Chris Rufo celebrated on Twitter after the Southlake election, saying this is the way, essentially. And you started to see national groups like the Heritage Foundation and the National Review put out articles or documents citing Southlake as the strategy that you should follow in your town. You need to FOIA your school district to look for DEI curriculum. You need to put together a political action committee and raise money. You need to back a slate of candidates. Step by step, here's what you need to do to turn your local nonpartisan school board race into a left versus right partisan battle. Good versus evil is the way it is framed in some cases. And it's in that context that you had Steve Bannon suddenly in 2021 going on his War Room podcast and declaring that the key to saving America runs through the school boards. What he really was saying was, the key to get Donald Trump back into office is to fight these culture war issues in the suburbs. We can win back the kind of suburban, moderately conservative parents who rejected Trump. They'll come back to us because they don't like critical race theory. And then we can win back those school boards. We can win these local races, and then we can retake Congress and the White House as a result. And so you saw in 2021 and 2022, people like Ron DeSantis and the entire conservative movement in America kind of reorganize itself around fighting these battles in schools as this is the way we're going to win America back. And it really started with this playbook in Southlake.
How much of this, that you can estimate, I mean, and I'm not asking you to be like a, Nostradamus here, but, how much of this is based upon people's real values that just hadn't been tapped into in these places versus social training, like creating a campaign that changes people's mind to believe this way? And by this way, I mean, kind of like your schools are under attack. It's a Marxist plot. Diversity is bad, whatever. How much of that is they're really just tapping into what was already there and exploiting it versus we're teaching the community how to think like that?
I think it's both. There's a certain segment of just white folks in America broadly who had convinced themselves that racism doesn't exist in this era. I grew up in the 80s and 90s. Racism is something we learned about. It's in history. And so anytime it's brought up, there's a reflexive rejection of that. And I think but it's not something that these folks necessarily were going to the school board to complain about. I think what happened, what Chris Rufo opened the door to and others, was this talking point that critical race theory is this idea that's swept into your school secretly, and they're teaching white children to hate themselves, and they're teaching Black children that they're all victims, and that this is the modern Democratic Party. This is what they believe. And you could see in Southlake how that idea became part of the conversation prior to when the fight there really kicked off in 2020, right? In the summer. Chris Rufo hadn't gone on TV yet to talk about critical race theory. He hadn't created these talking points about white people being inherently bad or oppressors and Black people being inherently victims. But after he did that, the school board commentary in Southlake started to reflect those national talking points. And you could really see how it animated parents to say, wow, I hadn't realized that in Southlake, you all were trying to teach my white children that they're all racist. Now, there's no evidence that anyone anywhere has been teaching white children or white kindergartners, as Chris Rufo put it, that they're white supremacists, that they're inherently bad. It's what you would describe as maybe a straw man argument, where you've created this thing to attack. And it's really effective. It was really effective in getting parents upset, because when you panned the country and looked at school board meetings, not just in Southlake, but all over the country in 2021 and into 2022, there were white parents who were at times crying. There's a clip I think of out of the suburbs of St. Louis where mom's it looks real, or maybe, I don't know, it seemed real to me, tearing up just because I don't want my kids to learn about critical race theory doesn't make me a racist. Damn it,
Hmm.
that's in my head. And her voice is cracking, and she's very upset.
Yeah.
And it seems like that message of, wow, this thing that's sweeping the country where they're trying to teach all the white kids that they're bad really took root with people, like regular people.
Yeah. First of all, let's just back up just a little bit and say, in video games, when you create a video game, this is kind of a weird aside analogy, but when you create a video game, you have to do what's called world building. You have to create what the rules are going to be, who the villains and the protagonist is going to be, and the language and the vocabulary. That's how you create a game. Like you have to create the world. So the Rufos of the world have created an alternative universe where diversity is actually racism, where attempts to create inclusion are actually anti-white and exclusion. So they created a new world. They built a vocabulary for the thing that this might sound like really highly charged language, but I'm old enough to remember when David Duke got a facelift because he thought that he was going to normalize the work of white supremacy. And when Donald Trump came along, he praised Donald Trump for, that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to create the normalized language that made kind of a real battle against diversity efforts, civil rights, the progress of families and others. Now that sounds heavy-handed, I'm sure, but in some ways it's only because we haven't created a resistance vocabulary in our own world to fight back against the one that they created.
One of the things that's been fascinating to watch as this progressed was how the language has shifted to more over time to be even more direct in what you're talking about.
Hmm.
Because before it
Hmm.
was, I'm not opposed to diversity, or I'm not opposed to diversity, equity, diversity and inclusion. I'm opposed to critical race theory.
Hmm.
But over time, more words got put under the banner of critical race theory. And so then you started to see into 2021 and 2022, I started seeing, actually, if you see the word diversity in your curriculum or your school's, planning documents, that's a buzzword for critical race theory. The word diversity is now being identified as a sign of racism. And we see that now with, critical race theory fade from the headlines, but this year it's been a lot about DEI, and the DEI meaning, you're going to try to diversify your workforce. You're going to, have uh, expand the pool of applicants to take these uh, areas of society that are disproportionately dominated by white people and give more people an opportunity. And now it's you hear people like Charlie Kirk talk about DEI, and it just means hiring black people, like hiring a black pilot.
Hmm. It gets worse than that. Because Charlie Kirk now, we've normalized this to the point now where Charlie Kirk gets on his show and he says, when I get on a plane and I see a black pilot, it makes me
Right.
wonder, man, are we going to crash? And it makes it okay to call the vice president of the United States a DEI hire, right? Like to just kind of evaporate all of her credentials in life and all of her background and just say DEI hire. That's new. It's not new in spirit. That's part of the American tradition, but to be able to say it openly without
Right.
any fear of retribution for white people, that's new. They've shifted the Overton window to a place now where you can now be so pro-white that you can say these things and it's okay. What are the other broader impacts in education? Do you think that this has really taken root in terms of policies, classroom content, the way that we teach race, gender, and sexuality broadly, or is this really still a suburban school district problem?
It's the most acute in the suburbs, and in
Hmm.
rural
Hmm.
communities. However, there was a survey this year of thousands of public school teachers by the Rand Corporation that found that something like 2/3 of educators in America reported self censoring
Hmm.
conversations about race and racism, and avoiding subjects that might provoke parents, conservative parents. And what was interesting about that survey was it was across the board. It wasn't limited to school districts or states where there have been actually like policies
Hmm.
passed to restrict how teachers can talk about racism, because they're across the South and in red states across the country, there's laws in the books now that says if you talk about slavery, you can't say that it's like a foundational part of America. You have to present it as like a deviation from America's true greatness. Um, And you can't, if you teach, divisive subjects, you have to teach both sides, which leads some teachers to wonder, do I have to give the slave owner perspective, or the perspective of, you know, uh, white racists in the South during
Both
Jim Crow?
sides.
Right.
Both sides.
Right. And so I think it's hard to measure this, but I think there's strong evidence that this has shaped and reshaped the story that children are learning about America, and has really drastically cut back on the number of places in this country where students will go to school, kids who look like me growing up, and maybe learn a lesson in school about the privilege that comes with being a white person in America, just by the virtue of our history and who we are as a country. I think there's been a big retraction because of fear, because who wants to wind up on a libs of TikTok
Mm,
viral tweet?
mhm, mhm. Which has been a very effective social media tool to basically do their part. Like, hey, I'm on social media. I'm going to do my part to the movement here. Let me ask you a couple of questions. Around why is this successful? As somebody who's not white, as somebody who's looking at this take root in communities, some of the premises seem so dumb that I can't imagine that people honestly believe the premises. So the idea that your child is being victimized, white people are under attack, when the majority of Congress, the majority of the Senate, almost all of the governors in the country, all of the leaders of the seat of government, commerce, business, banking, whatever, are all white. Hollywood, keep going down the list of every area of American life activity. Actually, white people are in the lead, dominant, and own the table. So to be able to successfully tell a group of people that you are under attack by those diversity people, and the minorities are taken over, how does that work in terms of like actually believing that for someone who can look around and just see that we're not running everything, like we're not running the table, the diversity people and the minorities? It's kind of a long question, but I'm befuddled at how it works.
And you can hear it in comments from, I think of a white grandmother who came to a Carroll school board meeting early in their fight, and said, she's married to a Cuban American, and so she gives this comment that all 10 of my grandchildren are minorities. And we teach them that the most important thing to your success in America is how hard you work. Your skin color, your race, has no impact at all on your ability to succeed. And in the book, I let them say those, I print those comments. But in that case, I noted that she's saying this in the context of a country where, you know, uh, decades after the Civil Rights Act, Black Americans still have just a tiny fraction of the wealth of white Americans. And so, to your question about, do they believe that they're actually a victim, or that they're being persecuted, I do think there's two things to consider with that. And I saw it a lot in my reporting, was evangelical Christians in America have adopted a mindset that they are persecuted minority, and that is embedded in the culture. And Republican politics has also adopted that kind of a language of fear, and this idea of, we're under attack, we're the silent
Hmm.
majority, and
Hmm.
our like we're victims of this culture that's trying to destroy our way of life. And so I think that's been in, prior to these school board fights, that's just kind of been in the culture of conservative Christian America, that this idea. And I grew up in evangelical Christian spaces that were largely white, and I heard that it's like this idea that our way of life ever since the 1960s has been under attack, and we're basically, even though this country is overwhelmingly Christian, we're a persecuted minority. And so I think, to some extent, people were primed for this message. They were primed to believe that, even in my affluent suburban school district, my kid, who's part of the majority group in this school, is somehow under attack.
I mean, that's a super insightful point that I wouldn't have thought about, because when you add the Christianity to the thing, that's part of Christianity, is knowing that you're going to be in the world, not of it, and be persecuted by the world, right? And actually revel in the persecution because it means you're closer to Jesus. I mean, Jesus was persecuted. That makes sense. So when it comes to the race part, though, I wonder if it's fair to say that those of us that are African American or not non-white or people of color, we're getting wrapped up not because they're actually being antagonistic just to us, but it's the white progressive cultural juggernaut that they think we're part of.
The other part of white evangelical Christian culture in America is the entwining of your religion and the idea of American greatness. And so if you believe that God has blessed America to be a uniquely a city on a hill, like
Hmm.
God has ordained American exceptionalism, teaching kids that slavery was a foundational part of America's founding conflicts with that narrative. And so that's part of the reason why early in the fight over critical race theory, kind of Christian nationalist evangelical groups really leaned into the fight because uh, part of the you talk about world building. The world, their version of America is not racist, never was racist, and in fact, America's decline only began in the 1960s when progressive removed prayer from schools, and some would argue when they passed the civil rights laws. These things are all interconnected, and I think you can see that in the ways now that the fight over deep racial inclusion shifted to be the fight over LGBTQ inclusion, and then became, we're not just going to remove those things from schools, we're actually going to impose our Christian conservative worldview. We're going to hang the Ten Commandments up in classrooms in Louisiana. We're going to bring Bible lessons, mandatory Bible lessons to kids in Oklahoma and Texas. We're going to pass private school vouchers so that parents everywhere can send their kids to get public funding for their private Christian conservative education. Um, and I think that's part of what's driving all of this.
So, that saying around it's always darkest before the dawn. Right now, this feels like an unstoppable campaign. It's tapped into something that feels really successful. I know that conservatives are reveling in it privately. Conservative philanthropists are reveling in this. They feel like it's their moment. You have a guy last week from Heritage Foundation who says we're in the middle of another American revolution that is going to fundamentally change the country. And what he means is back to the way that they wanted it. And he says it could be bloodless if the left wants it to be, but the implication is, it doesn't have to be, but we're going to win. Sometimes it feels to me like people in history don't read when they're overplaying their hand, and they don't read the room on how hate it's not a renewable fuel source. It actually burns out at some time, and people get sick of just being kind of hate. That's just my opinion. So I'm wondering if you think that there's a crest to this, there's an arc, and they overplay their hand, and it creates the resistance that gets us back to where we were, and we progress again.
Back to Steve Bannon's line from 2021, where he said that the path to save America runs through the school boards, how we're going to fight these issues. And, groups like Moms for Liberty stood themselves up, and the Republican Party
Mm-hmm.
rebuilt itself around this. And, again, the theory being we're going to win more people to our side through these fights. It hasn't really played out. And so what's happened
Mm-hmm.
instead is they've been really successful at taking the kind of the ugliest divisions of our national politics and injecting those into what used to be nonpartisan, kind of sleepy school board races. And so you see really ugly and kind of expensive nonpartisan elections in the suburbs. That's happening all over the country. But they haven't won people to their side so much as just energized both bases over on these issues. And so you see Moms for Liberty actually losing in a lot of communities. What I've seen over and over and over again is if your suburban school district is one like Southlake, where Trump won in 2020 with 60 some percent of the vote, the Moms for Liberty, Southlake Families PAC folks are going to probably win your school board. If you're in a more purple or left leaning suburb, they probably won't, because we've seen in communities all over the country now this kind of group of progressive and moderate conservative, just George Bush, Mitt Romney type Republicans who reject Trump. They've banded together because they don't like Moms for Liberty. They don't think that
Mm-hmm.
we should be imposing conservative Christian values in public schools or or taking public schools and sending it off to public school funding and sending it to private Christian schools. And so in lots of places across the country, I've seen those groups get organized and kind of win their school boards. And, in some of them, I point in the book, I point to a community outside of Austin, Texas, this suburb called Round Rock. It's a fast growing, diversifying, used to be conservative, now is more purple community. And they had a Southlake Families PAC inspired attempt to take over the school board. And the progressive and moderate conservative parents formed their own group. And they ran on a campaign with a slogan of "Make school boards boring again." And they won by double digits. That message resonated with people who were like, you know what? I don't want to think about this. Or some people who maybe like really are passionate about their school being a place where their transgender child is allowed to be themselves. It ranges from folks who are just like, I don't want this fight. I don't want to hear about this, to progressives or just people of color, LGBTQ people who want to be safe and included. And there's kind of a coalition on that side saying, let's make school boards boring again. Let's stop talking about this stuff.
I mean, it feels like that people don't want chaos, regardless of your political affiliation. You just don't want chaos in your schools all the time.
Yeah.
It's cute for a few moments to have your school board meetings blow up, but after a while, that just becomes kind of annoying.
Absolutely. I'm working on a story right now about a very conservative, it's like a Trump 80% district in North Texas, where everyone, including the educators, are mostly Republican Christians. And a far right faction there waged a war over library books that went to the point where a constable law enforcement agent spent 2 years investigating, trying to do criminal charges against school librarians. And I'm talking to a lot of very conservative people, including people who support Donald Trump in that community, who are like, no, we don't want our librarians, who are also like we sit with at church, because this is not some far left activist. They don't need to go to prison for having a YA fantasy novel on their shelf. That's too far. And I think there is a blowback to this. That's rippling.
In your book, you mention a name that I hadn't heard in a long time, Anita Bryant. And I'm old enough to remember Anita Bryant. For people who aren't and haven't, Anita Bryant was a fairly charismatic cultural figure, represented kind of like white womanhood in a lot of ways, who was able to kind of use her fame as a platform to go after gays in schools. Gay teachers, are causing a problem. And the idea was to kind of galvanize the same people we're trying to today, white moms, to fear that their kids were somehow going to be turned gay or something in schools. And I haven't seen an Anita Bryant type rise now, very charismatic. I expected it to come out of Moms for Liberty, somebody who was very charismatic, the motherly type, to say, listen, I'm just a regular, white mom, and I'm just kind of afraid some of this stuff is wacky and is going too far and our kids are going to be damaged. Didn't see it happen, really. I don't know if you have any thoughts about why in some ways it feels like they were almost there. But you just mentioned Moms for Liberty lost a lot of the races that they were putting people up for. And I didn't expect that. In my mind, I was predicting this is a really good thing to tap into. This is going to win. And it didn't.
Yeah.
Kind of just fell off. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, you're right. There's been lots of local and kind of regional figures like that who are presenting themselves as, I'm here. There's lots of "Save Our Kids" was Anita Bryant's slogan, and we're seeing a lot of "Save Our Kids, Protect Our Kids" local and statewide organizations cropping up around protecting kids from transgender identity in schools. But I have not seen Anita Bryant like national figure. But in the book, I make a comparison though between the things that she said and kind of her tactics of presenting all gay people as predators, as inherently evil and corrupt. I keep coming back. Libs of TikTok is that online account by Chanya Raychik, and the reason I bring her up is because she's been incredibly successful at laundering that kind of language about LGBTQ people into mainstream Republican political discourse, to the point where Ron DeSantis invited her to stay at the governor's mansion after she became identified, and she was scared of harassment as a result of that. and the school superintendent, the kind of Christian nationalist school superintendent in Oklahoma named Ryan Walters, named her, even though she lives
Mhm.
in some other state, he named her to serve on the
Yeah.
state's library advisory committee, and she's making recommendations about school library book policies for the state of Oklahoma. She the thing she says is like a 2024 version of Anita Bryant. She like the
Mm.
LGBTQ
Mhm.
community is, they're coming for your kids. They're recruiting. They're trying to convert your kids. It's part of this evil
Mhm.
agenda. It's Anita Bryant 2.0. She's not,
Mhm.
Florida orange juice spokesperson, but she's maybe an Anita Bryant figure for a very online age.
That's such a good rebuttal to my question. I mean, she is charismatic to an extent. She's younger. She's attractive. She's not necessarily considered frumpy and old. Like, it's a good play, I think, on a younger for a younger generation. That is the better version of the Anita Bryant. Okay, Mike, point proven. you 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 rebutted my question there.
It came in a different form than we may have imagined. Yeah,
Yeah,
she's
and she
very
has a different
online.
platform. She's got a very good platform to do it. Just as an aside, one of the things you just said, that she got put on a library board in a state, and she has no credentials or background for that role. Christopher Rufo got put onto the board of a very kind of leftist college in Florida with no kind of background, for that particular position. At the same time, you're talking about a group of people who want there to be a meritocracy, and there not to be any kind of like special favors given to anybody. We should just all be like, equally qualified or whatnot. Meanwhile, they're putting the most, underdeveloped people into some very important roles. That aside, too, last question on this part that I would ask is around race was the beginning of this as the catnip, if we could like make things about race. But that didn't seem like it was a deep enough well, and not, America isn't quite as enamored with, white supremacist racism as they are, as maybe they had been. And you quote Christopher Rufo as saying that there is like a deeper reservoir with the sexual issues, right? And I did notice at some point it switched to trans people, and not just gay people and gay lesbians and bisexuals, but the trans part became the winner. And why do you think that is? Because in my everyday life, I don't really encounter, like, I'm a parent, I've got multiple kids in the traditional public schools, district schools. We never encounter this. So why would it be so easy to get me to freak out about it?
I think they're tapping into something that is real, in the sense that the way teenagers today talk and think about gender is dramatically different than when I was a kid in the 1990s. And I
Hmm.
think so. A lot
Hmm.
of parents who are Gen Xers and millennials um, we're waking up to this, that you know it's not that there are more people who are trans. It's that society shifted, or seemed to be shifting, to make it more socially acceptable and safe for these
Hmm.
kids to say,
Hmm.
this is who I am. So when conservatives talk about teachers as being these people, the source of this, your education system, you've noticed that your kids' friends use non-binary gender pronouns, or that your own kid maybe has said they're a different gender than the one that was on their birth certificate. And then these people come forward and say, like Libs of TikTok, or Chris Rufo, or anyone else, and saying, the teacher did it. It's the library books. They convinced your kids to change genders. This is part of a bigger plot to destroy America and attack kids and hurt kids, to groom kids, which is, a very loaded term that became very popular. That's resonated. They're connecting an actual genuine change in culture and society with this very dark and scary talking point to explain why it's happening, without evidence. I investigated this very aggressively, zeroed in on a specific case where a mom had come forward in North Texas and said, a teacher with a book convinced my kid to change genders. The things she was saying sounded exactly like Ron DeSantis's stump
Hmm.
speech. And when we investigated it, it was like, well, no, that's not accurate. This kid had come out to her parent. Both of her parents were divorced as transgender
Hmm.
when she
Hmm.
was a teenager, years earlier, before she even met this teacher. The teacher had merely agreed to call her by her preferred pronouns, and she had a book called The Prince and the Dressmaker. That's not even about transgender people. It's just about a prince who likes wearing dresses and feels like he has to hide it. So that's, but yeah, it's resonated with people who are trying to understand what's changed and why is this happening to my kids. And then on top of that, they've connected it with kind of this campaign that says, this extraordinary number of children are undergoing gender reassignment surgeries, which is not true. But it went so far in one place, or multiple places I've seen this, where a far right pastor in North Texas claimed that kids were getting gender affirming care at the nurse's office in their school districts, and it's just like he just
Jesus.
blending everything together. But it's scary, and if people believe
Yeah.
it, they're scared.
Yeah, and just a bit of commentary on my part. I actually think so. So there's two things. I really love history and reading history, and these people have always existed. This play that we're having isn't brand new. This is a cycle. We've had this exact same drama in the 80s, the 70s, the 60s, the 50s, going back. And every time civil rights opens the franchise to a new group of people, that group of people are seen as, you're going too far now. And all it really is that progress over time bends towards greater liberalization of the society, meaning more people can be in the franchise. But it's always fought. There's always a group of people. I mean, when Dr. King was fighting on the day that he was killed, the majority of Americans didn't have a great opinion of him. And there was this thing around, he's a Marxist, he's trying to change the country. Really, what he's trying to do is make sure that we didn't have to sit in the back of the bus and that we could have equal opportunity. But that was reframed as going too far, pushing the culture further than one. And every decade since, there has been a version of this in the 70s, the 80s. I grew up in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. And it's almost like, at what point do we get pattern recognition? Because some people are acting like this is brand new. Like they're acting like, oh, we haven't seen this before. This is really, and the trans people are just really going too far. And really all that's happening is America's living up to its creed of being a place where everyone can pursue happiness on their own terms, right? And there's always going to be people that fight that because they want things to stay the way they were. So that's a bit of commentary on my part. I get really animated about the trans issue, specifically because in my reading of history in Germany and other places, your feathers should always go up when you see a population people as being smeared as inhuman in some ways. That should be, regardless of who they are, whether they're trans or black or white or Samoan, whatever it is, your antennas should go up the moment you hear that group of people should be eradicated from American life, which is something that a conservative said about trans people. Doesn't even matter who he's talking about. That should make your antennas go up. So the last where I would love to end on is your person, Mike. You're not just a reporter. You're not just a person writing a book. You're not just an author. There has to be some sort of personal effect of following these stories and how you personalize it to your own life. Could you talk about that a little bit? Like, how have you personally grown in being the teller of this story?
Well, the story began, the reason I got into this in the first place is because in 2020, that summer, when, I was living in a suburb outside of Houston and saw firsthand the ways that my little neighborhood was going to war with itself. And some of my conservative neighbors were posting on our neighborhood Facebook page about, how Antifa was coming to shoot up the neighborhood, and just very kind of apocalyptic language. That was a kind of silly but and annoying, but also kind of scary to see, like, the neighbors are getting ammo to prepare for this coming war they think is going to happen. But my wife, who's a Black biracial woman, was having a much more visceral reaction. It made her feel like we aren't safe here. We're not welcome here. And I was almost caught off guard by how emotional and upset she was, and it made me realize she's not the only one feeling like this right now in America, in these types of communities. And so that kind of propelled me to report on this. And then in the midst of reporting on this, I'm going to be a little bit guarded how I talk about it, because it's not only my story to share, but I'm a dad of 4 kids. I was raising them in Texas, and Texas has gone further than a lot of states in restricting what teachers can do to make a kid feel welcome in their class if their gender or sexual orientation is different than the one that Texas legislators prefer. And so I saw that firsthand, how that was affecting kids, how parents were pulling kids out of school. And one of my own children
Mm-hmm.
articulated their identity to me in a very clear way, to me and my wife, in the midst of me working on this book. Um, and that is why I'm talking to you from Maryland,
Mm-hmm.
as opposed to Texas right now, is because at the end of the day, we didn't want to send our kids to a school district where a teacher might be prohibited from, you know, teaching a lesson or pulling out a book to teach the other children how to be kind to my kid. And I
Mm-hmm.
had the privilege of being able to relocate and still do the job I love. And so I know that parents and teachers all over the country are having those same conversations, especially in these places and these communities that have kind of made it so that a teacher, if it conflicts with their personal religious beliefs, they're allowed to dead name your kid, even if you say don't do that.
Mm-hmm.
It
Mm-hmm.
went from parents' rights to just no trans identities permitted in some places, and it's hard to watch that. It's hard to watch that play out, and it's part of what's driven me on this. Is I think um, we all, as parents, we all care deeply about getting our kids a great education, but also raising them in a community and an environment where they are supported and not marginalized, but respected. And some families all over the country are feeling like it's harder to figure out where that is. Where do I get that great education, um, and have my kid feel respected at the same time?
It just stabs me in the heart. Like as a dad myself, multiple times over, a dad of multiples, that stabs me right in the heart. Like, and I wonder, listening to you talk about that, I wonder where our movement is. I mean, you just mentioned parental rights. Where are our parental rights? Where's our parental right movement? Where's the movement to keep our kids safe and to have a say and to have somebody yell at a school board meeting about my kid belongs here? Damn it, I pay taxes for these schools. These schools are going to be welcoming for my kid. I don't care who doesn't like it. And if you're not me, then maybe I need a different movement. I don't know if there's an answer to that. I don't know if you have an answer to that, but it does feel like we don't have a movement yet of the other parents.
Yeah, there's pockets of that all over the country. Though I think there's a lot of parents who've banded together in different groups. They don't get the same level of recognition maybe as Moms for Liberty, but there are groups
They're
of,
there.
they're out there. I'm going to avoid name checking them right now because I don't want to sound like I'm endorsing specific groups, but
Yeah.
there have been, there are groups out there who are, um, you know, trying to be the counter to that, and they've also presented themselves as moms, but of a
Mhm.
different viewpoint, moms who are going to love you no matter what, even if you're not their kid. Is that's out there.
I'm going to start a movement of dads. I'm going to start the dad
Yeah,
movement and get us out there. Mike, I really appreciate you spending this time with us today. Your book is very enlightening, and we are going to give away some copies of your book to our audience and to our listeners because I think it's an important story for people to hear and to read and to internalize. And it would be great if at some point if there was like a workbook of this is how you actualize this information into a parent revolution of some sort. Really appreciate you so much. Where do you want people to follow you? How do you want them to stay in touch with you and your work?
you can follow my work on mikehixenbaugh.com, and I'm also on various social media, including the platform formerly known as Twitter. I'm still posting away over there and on Threads, and so yeah, come give me a follow.
On Threads. Are you
Yes,
really?
I'm over there. I'm trying,
Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay. All
trying
right.
to
You're
make it
holding
work.
it up, man. Well, listen, I when I saw your book come across, I actually reached out to your publishing company, and I didn't know that you were going to come on. I didn't. I just figured like it's a shot in the dark. I'm interested in the story. I hope that he gives us the time, and you
Absolutely.
did. So I really appreciate that. For everybody listening and watching, this is Always Learning, and the reason that we call it Always Learning is that I was told as a school board member years ago to stop saying our kids aren't learning. They're always learning something, even when they're not learning what we want them to. Their brains are elastic. And as adults, we have to carry that on too. We can't be adults that think learning just happens in the K through 12 years. We have to keep learning. And this is my attempt to keep learning, talking to people like Mike so that we can learn more and more and more about the stories that we hear about in the papers and grow from it. Thank you guys all for watching. This has been another episode of Always Learning.